Sheriff, I'm here to turn myself in for the bank robbery.
Well, that's mighty convenient. What made you change your mind?
I'm giving you one chance to surrender.
There are some silences that are peaceful, the kind a man seeks out in the vast, empty cathedrals of the plains. And then there are other silences, the heavy, sick kind. The kind that presses down on you, suffocating the air from your lungs, a silence that screams louder than any gunshot. That was the silence that greeted Silas Kane as he rode his tired roan-gelding ghost over the final rise overlooking the town of Providence. He'd been riding for 3 days, the grit of the trail a second skin, but this feeling, this oppressive quiet, was more exhausting than any mile he'd ever covered. Silas was a man who understood silence. He was carved from it. His face was a testament to hard sun and harder choices, and his eyes, the color of faded denim, held the distant, haunted look of a man who had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He wasn't looking for a town. He was looking for a place to forget a place, where the ghosts of his past might finally quiet their whispering. But the silence of Providence wasn't quiet at all. It was waiting. Providence was a town gasping for breath. It clung to the banks of a half-dead creek, its dusty main street lined with buildings that sagged like tired old men. A saloon with swinging doors that didn't swing, a general store with windows so clouded with grime they looked blind, and at the far end of the street a stark new structure that didn't belong. It was a gallows. The raw, pale lumber of the thing seemed to leach the very color from the afternoon sun. It was an obscenity against the vast blue canvas of the sky. And the entire town, every man, woman, and child not hiding behind their curtains, was gathered before it. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were watching, their faces blank and hollow, as if they were participants in a ritual they didn't understand but were too terrified to defy. Silas's gaze was drawn from the crowd to the platform, and the knot that was always present in his gut tightened into a cold, hard fist. Standing there with her hands bound behind her back and a thick plaited rope already around her neck was a girl. She was barely out of her teens, slender and wiry, with the sun-kissed skin and capable hands of a farmer's daughter. Her calico dress was torn and dirty, but she stood tall, her chin held at an angle of defiance that the noose around her neck couldn't diminish. Her hair, the color of sun-cured wheat, was a wild mess, but it was her eyes that seized Silas's attention and wouldn't let go. They were a deep, clear blue, and in them he saw not just fear, but a blazing, righteous fury. She wasn't begging for her life. She was condemning them all with a single, silent glare. At the foot of the gallows stood 2 men who were clearly in charge of this grim affair. The first was the town sheriff, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his vest, his face flushed and sweaty. He looked uncomfortable out of his depth, his eyes darting nervously between the girl and the second man. This second man was the true authority here. He was dressed in a tailored black suit that was ridiculously out of place in this dusty backwater. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his face, handsome in a severe predatory way, was set in a mask of cold satisfaction. He held a gold pocket watch in his hand, checking the time as if he were waiting for a train rather than an execution. This was a man who bent the world to his will, a man who saw other people not as souls but as tools or obstacles. Silas dismounted, letting Ghost's reins drop to the ground. The horse was well trained. It wouldn't move. Every head turned as Silas began to walk down the center of the street, the soft jingle of his spurs, the only sound to break the unnatural quiet. He felt their eyes on him, 100 warnings, 100 pleas to turn back. "This isn't your business, stranger. Ride on." He could hear the words as clearly as if they'd been spoken aloud. He ignored them. His past was a gallery of moments when he had ridden on, when he had minded his own business, and the memory of each one was a scar on his soul. He had been a Texas Ranger once a long time ago, before a single bloody afternoon in a town not unlike this one had convinced him that the law was just a weapon and justice was a far rarer commodity. He'd turned in his badge and had been wandering ever since. He stopped a few yards from the gallows, his gaze meeting that of the man in the black suit. "There a trial?" Silas asked. His voice was rough like stones grinding together, but it carried in the silence. The man in the suit snapped his pocket watch shut and slipped it into his vest. His eyes, the color of cold gray slate, appraised Silas with a dismissive air. "I am Alistair Finch," he said, his voice cultured and sharp. "And this is a private matter. The girl murdered her own father," she confessed. "The good people of Providence demand justice." A murmur went through the crowd, but it wasn't a murmur of agreement. It was something else, a shudder of fear. Silas looked back at the girl. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of something. Was it hope, or was it just surprise that anyone had dared to speak? "Confessed," Silas said, his gaze sweeping over the cowed townspeople. Or was a confession beaten out of her? Finch's face darkened. The mask of civility slipped. "You have a choice, stranger," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You can get back on your horse and ride out of this town, or you can be buried in it. Sheriff, proceed." The sweaty sheriff flinched, then nodded to a deputy on the platform. The deputy moved to kick the lever that would drop the trapdoor. The girl closed her eyes, her defiant posture finally crumbling, her body tensing for the fall. And in that moment, Silas saw another face from his past. A young homesteader, a wife and mother, strung up by vigilantes who had coveted her family's land, all while he and his fellow rangers had been ordered to stand down to let local justice take its course. He hadn't spoken up then. He hadn't drawn his weapon. He had followed orders, and he had spent the last 10 years trying to drink away the memory of the light dying in her eyes. He wouldn't make that mistake again. He moved with a speed that was shocking in a man of his size and weariness. It was a blur of motion. Before the deputy's foot could touch the lever, before Finch could even register what was happening, Silas had his Colt Peacemaker in his hand. He didn't aim at a man, he aimed at the rope. The gunshot was a thunderclap that shattered the silence. The thick rope, frayed by the bullet's passage, snapped with a loud crack. The girl fell not through the trapdoor, but onto the platform, coughing and gasping as the weight of the noose was lifted. For a heartbeat, the world was frozen. Then it exploded. Finch let out a roar of pure animalistic rage. The sheriff fumbled for his gun. The crowd, shocked out of its stupor, began to scatter. Silas didn't hesitate. He holstered his pistol, drew the heavy Bowie knife from his belt, and vaulted onto the platform. He slashed through the bindings on the girl's wrists, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her toward the edge of the gallows. "Come on!" he yelled over the rising chaos. He had just shot the town's justice in the throat. He hadn't just interrupted an execution. He had single-handedly declared war on Alistair Finch and the entire town of Providence. That single gunshot was the beginning of a storm, and we're about to ride right into the heart of it. If you're captivated by these tales of the untamed frontier of lone riders and the fight for what's right, then you're in the right place. Help us keep these stories alive. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and make sure you ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss a moment of what happens when a stranger decides that silence is no longer an option. Your support is the fuel that keeps our campfire burning, bringing these incredible stories to you week after week. The aftermath of the gunshot was pure, unadulterated bedlam. Alistair Finch's bellow of rage was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Kill 'em both!" he shrieked, his handsome face contorted into a mask of pure fury. The spell of fear that had held Providence in its grip was broken, replaced by the instinct for self-preservation. Townspeople scrambled for cover, knocking over barrels at each other in their haste to get out of the line of fire. The sheriff, finally managing to draw his weapon, fired a wild shot that splintered the gallows platform a foot to Silas's left. It was the shot of a panicked man, not a seasoned lawman. Silas didn't waste an instant. He hauled the farmer's daughter, whose name he still didn't know, to her feet. Her legs were shaky and she was still gasping for air, the raw red mark of the rope, a brutal necklace on her skin. "Can you ride?" he growled, his voice, a low note of urgency in the cacophony. She nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. He didn't wait for a verbal answer. He half-dragged, half-carried her to the edge of the platform and jumped, pulling her with him. They landed in a heap in the thick dust of the main street, the fall knocking the wind out of them. Ghost, his faithful roan, was already moving toward them, responding to a silent command, a lifetime of trust between man and horse. Another bullet whined past Silas's ear, this one fired by one of Finch's men who had been standing near the platform. They were finding their nerve. Silas shoved the girl toward his horse. "Get on." Now he used his own body as a shield, pushing her up into the saddle. She was lighter than he expected, all sinew and bone. As she scrambled to get her footing, he vaulted up behind her, the worn leather of the saddle groaning under their combined weight. He wrapped one arm around her waist to hold her steady, grabbing the reins with his other hand. He could feel the frantic, wild beating of her heart against his chest. He spun Ghost around, not away from the town, but deeper into it, a calculated risk, born from years of being the hunted. A straight run for the open plains would make them an easy target. Their only hope was to use the town itself as a shield, a maze of alleys and obstacles. He urged Ghost into a full gallop, the horse's powerful muscles bunching and releasing beneath them. The main street, which had been a stage for a grim execution moments before, was now their racetrack. Finch's men, recovering from the initial shock, were mounting their own horses, their shouts and curses echoing off the false-fronted buildings. He risked a glance over his shoulder. 4, maybe 5 riders were in pursuit, with Finch himself surprisingly not among them. The tycoon was a man who gave orders, not one who risked his own skin. Silas yanked the reins, guiding Ghost into a narrow gap between the blacksmith's shop and the feed store. The alley was a chaotic mess of discarded wagon wheels and empty crates. He navigated the obstacle course with the fluid grace of a man who had spent more of his life in a saddle than out of it. They burst out of the alley into a small livery yard, scattering a flock of chickens. The sound of their pursuers was momentarily muffled, confused by the sudden turn. He had bought them precious seconds. He pushed the horse harder, heading for the edge of town, where the respectable buildings gave way to a shanty town of miners' shacks and tents. "Hold on," he yelled to the girl as they hit a rough patch of road. Her arms tightened around his waist, her face pressed against his back. He could feel her trembling, but he could also feel the steel in her spine. This was not a girl who would break easily. They cleared the last of the shacks and galloped out into the Badlands, a twisted, hostile landscape of canyons and rock spires that the locals probably had a grim name for. It was a fugitive's paradise and a posse's nightmare. He pushed Ghost down a steep, shale-covered slope into a dry riverbed, the arroyo walls rising up on either side of them, swallowing the last of the afternoon light. The sound of the pursuit became a distant, muffled drumming, but Silas knew they wouldn't give up. A man like Finch would not tolerate being defied. This was not just about a dead farmer anymore. It was about power. Silas had publicly challenged him, and Finch would hunt them to the ends of the earth to make an example of them. He followed the serpentine path of the arroyo for miles, pushing the horse until its sides were heaving, and its coat was dark with sweat. Finally, when the sound of the posse had faded completely into the whisper of the wind, he slowed Ghost to a walk. He needed to find a place to hide, a place to rest the horse and figure out their next move. He found it in a deep recess in the canyon wall, a shallow cave concealed by a thick tangle of wild grapevines. It was dark and cool inside and smelled of damp earth. He slid from the saddle, his muscles screaming in protest. He reached up to help the girl down, and her legs gave out as soon as her feet touched the ground. He caught her easily, his hands circling her waist, and for a moment they stood there in the darkness, the adrenaline of the chase slowly beginning to recede, leaving a cold, stark reality in its place. He guided her to a smooth rock and gently sat her down. He rummaged in his saddlebags, his hands finding his canteen and a small tin of salve. He handed her the water. "Small sips," he said, his voice softer now. She drank greedily, the water spilling down her chin. When she was done, she looked at him, her blue eyes huge and luminous in the gloom. "Why," she whispered, her voice raw and hoarse, "you don't even know me." "Why did you do that?" Silas paused, uncorking the canteen to take a drink himself. He thought about how to answer, how to explain the ghosts that rode with him, the promise he had made to a dead woman 10 years ago. But he settled for a simpler truth. "I was tired of watching," he said quietly. He opened the tin of salve, its clean, sharp scent of pine and herbs filling the small space. He gestured to her neck. "That needs tending." She flinched as he gently touched the raw, rope-burned skin, but she didn't pull away. His fingers, calloused and rough from years of holding reins and a gun, were surprisingly gentle as he applied the soothing ointment. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of the town, but something different. It was a space for truths to be spoken. "They said you confessed," he said, his voice neutral, not accusing. "They said you killed your father." He felt her stiffen under his touch. He finished applying the salve and pulled his hand away, giving her space. He waited. He had risked everything for her, a decision made on instinct and old wounds. Now, sitting in the dark with the posse hunting them, he needed to know if that instinct had led him true. "My father was the most honest man I ever knew," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. "He loved this land more than anything. He wouldn't sell. Finch wanted our farm. The creek that runs through it is the only reliable water source for 10 miles. It's the key to his whole plan for the railroad spur. So Finch tried to buy him out," Silas surmised. "He tried to threaten him out," she corrected. "And when that didn't work, someone came to the farm 2 nights ago. I was in the barn. I heard a gunshot. I ran to the house and I found him." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "The sheriff was there in less than 10 minutes. Too fast. It was like he was waiting. He said he found me standing over the body with my father's hunting rifle in my hands. It was a lie. I never touched it. They dragged me to town, threw me in a cell. The sheriff and another man, they beat me. They told me if I didn't sign the confession, they would burn our farm to the ground and say my little brother did it." The story came tumbling out raw and painful, but it rang with the unmistakable clarity of truth. It was a classic land grab dressed up as frontier justice. But one piece was still missing. "Your brother Silas," asked, his voice low. "Where is he?" Her face, already pale, seemed to lose all its color. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's only 14. His name is Caleb. He ran when they came for me. He saw them. He knows I'm innocent. That's why Finch wants me dead so quickly. It's not just about silencing me. It's about getting the farm legally. If I'm hanged for murder, he can seize the property. But if Caleb is out there, he's the rightful heir. And he's a witness." The situation had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous. They weren't just fugitives anymore. They were the protectors of a 14-year-old boy who was alone in the wilderness, hunted by the same men who were hunting them. And he was the only thing standing between Alistair Finch and an undisputed empire. Before Silas could even begin to process this new information, Ghost, who had been standing quietly at the mouth of the cave, let out a low warning nicker and flattened his ears. Silas's hand instantly went to his Colt. He crept to the edge of the vines and peered out. Far down the arroyo, a single point of light, a lantern was bobbing in the darkness. The posse hadn't given up. They were coming. And they were closer than he thought. The lone lantern was a baleful yellow eye sweeping back and forth across the canyon floor, methodically searching. It was still a good distance away, but it was moving with a purpose that sent a chill down Silas's spine. This wasn't a random search by a group of angry townsmen. This was a professional hunt. Alistair Finch hadn't just sent his thugs. He had sent a tracker. Silas pulled back from the edge of the cave, his mind kicking into a cold tactical gear forged by years of similar situations. The relief of their escape was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of a prolonged and deadly pursuit. "They're still on us," he said, his voice a low whisper. "One rider moving too fast. He knows what he's doing." The girl whose name he still hadn't asked pushed herself to her feet. The mention of her brother seemed to have ignited a new fire in her, burning away the last vestiges of her victimhood. "We have to find Caleb before they do," she said, her voice firm, no longer the whisper of a frightened girl, but the command of a woman with a mission. "He's smart. He knows the land around our farm, but he's just a boy. He won't stand a chance against them." "What's your name?" Silas asked the question, suddenly seeming absurdly important. "Elspeth," she replied. "My friends call me Ellie." "All right, Ellie," Silas said the name, feeling solid and real on his tongue. "We'll find him. But first we have to lose the man with the lantern." He looked around their small cave. It was a temporary refuge at best. The tracker would find their trail leading into it eventually. They had to move, but not in a panic. They had to be smarter. He began to uncinch his saddle, his movements quick and efficient in the near darkness. "What are you doing?" Ellie asked, watching him strip the gear from his horse. "Leaving a ghost," he said. He took his heavy bedroll and his spare shirt from his saddlebags. He then led Ghost deeper into the narrow cave as far back as the animal could go. He whispered to the horse, stroking its neck, hoping it would remain quiet. He took his knife and scraped a few shavings from Ghost's hoof into the dust at the cave's entrance, a subtle but clear sign for a skilled tracker. He then took his bedroll and began to drag it on the ground, leading away from the cave and further down the arroyo, scuffing the dirt to mimic the tracks of a man on foot, a man who was tired and possibly injured. "They'll follow that trail," he explained in a hushed tone. "He'll think we've abandoned the horse and are trying to make a run for it on foot. It'll buy us time." "And us?" Ellie asked, catching on quickly. "We go up," he said, pointing to a dark, treacherous-looking fissure in the canyon wall behind their hiding spot. The last place he'll expect. The climb was a brutal vertical ordeal. The fissure was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through a jagged scar of rock that ascended into the darkness. Silas went first, finding handholds and footholds in the crumbling rock, testing each one before calling down quiet instructions to Ellie. She followed without hesitation, her farmer's strength and wiry frame making her a natural climber. She moved with a surprising grace, her fear overshadowed by a fierce determination. They moved in silence, their ragged breathing, the only sound every dislodged pebble, a potential betrayal that could send a fatal clatter down to the canyon floor. They paused for a moment, on a narrow ledge halfway up their bodies, pressed against the cold stone to catch their breath. The lantern below was closer now. They could just make out the shape of the rider, a tall, gaunt man who sat his horse with an unnatural stillness. He dismounted near the entrance to their cave, moving with a slow, deliberate patience that was more terrifying than any frantic chase. He knelt, studying the ground, his lantern casting his long, distorted shadow against the canyon wall. "He's found our tracks," Silas whispered, his voice tight. As they watched, the tracker entered the cave. He was inside for a long minute, then re-emerged. He raised his lantern, his gaze sweeping the canyon floor, and then, as Silas had predicted, he found the false trail of the dragged bedroll. The tracker followed it for a few yards, then stopped. He seemed to be considering it. For a heart-stopping moment, Silas thought the ruse had failed. But then the man mounted his horse and proceeded down the arroyo, following the false trail into the darkness. The trap had been sprung. They waited until the lantern was a distant firefly before resuming their climb. They finally pulled themselves over the rim of the canyon onto a wide, wind-swept mesa, the star-filled sky stretching above them like a vast, diamond-dusted blanket. They were scraped, bruised, and exhausted, but they were for the moment free. They found shelter in a shallow depression among the rocks and collapsed the cold desert wind, a harsh but welcome balm on their skin. It was there, under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, that Ellie filled in the rest of the story. Her father, John Monroe, hadn't just been a stubborn farmer. He had been the unofficial leader of the local homesteaders. Alistair Finch's railroad needed a clear right-of-way, and the land he wanted was owned by a dozen small-time ranchers and farmers like the Monroes. John Monroe had discovered that the original land grants, the ones Finch was using to claim ownership, were forgeries. "My father was a self-educated man," Ellie explained, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sorrow. "He loved the law. He rode to the territorial capital 2 months ago and spent a week in the land office going over the records. He found it. The original survey map and the one true deed, signed and sealed by the territorial governor himself, granting this valley to the settlers who homesteaded it. He made a copy. This changed everything. This wasn't just a land grab. It was a massive illegal conspiracy, and Ellie's father had the proof. "Where is it now?" Silas asked, his voice urgent. "The copy of the deed. He hid it," she said. "He was so afraid Finch would find out. He told me he put it in the heart of the family, a place where it would be safe until he could get it to a federal marshal. He was planning to leave this week. He never got the chance. The heart of the family. The phrase was a riddle. It could mean anything. The house, Silas guessed. No, Ellie said, shaking her head. That's the first place they would have looked. And they did. The sheriff tore our home apart after they took me. He said he was looking for evidence. He was looking for the deed. They were sitting on a bombshell, a piece of paper that could dismantle Finch's entire empire and prove Ellie's innocence beyond a shadow of a doubt. But the key to it all was locked away in a riddle, and the only other person who might know the answer was a 14-year-old boy lost and alone in the wilderness. We need to think like your father, Silas said, his mind sifting through the possibilities. And we need to think like your brother. Where would Caleb go? Where would he feel safe? There's an old line shack, Ellie said after a moment's thought. Up in the high meadows on the far side of our property. It's hidden in a grove of aspens. Caleb and my father used to go there on hunting trips. It was their special place. If he's hiding, he'll be there. They finally had a destination, a tangible goal in the vast hostile wilderness. Find the line shack, find Caleb, and hopefully find the key to unlocking the riddle of the true deed. But as dawn began to break, painting the eastern sky in pale shades of gray and rose, they saw a thin plume of smoke rising from the direction of the canyon they had just escaped. The tracker, he had discovered the abandoned bedroll, realized he'd been tricked and had backtracked. The smoke was a signal. He was calling the rest of the posse, letting them know the hunt was back on. Their brief respite was over. They were exposed on the open mesa on foot with a professional hunter and his pack of wolves closing in. The race to find Caleb had just become a race for their lives. The rising sun offered no comfort, only exposure. The mesa was a wide, flat killing ground, offering little more cover than sparse sagebrush and the occasional cluster of rocks. The smoke signal to the south was a stark reminder that their enemy was not only relentless, but also intelligent. The tracker Kane, as he was known in the saloons and bunkhouses, a name whispered with a mixture of fear and respect, would not be fooled a second time. He would know they had climbed the canyon wall. He would be on their trail within the hour. We move now, Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a commander, a man who had learned to wall off fear and exhaustion in the face of necessity. We need to get to the broken country to the east. More rocks, more trees. A better place to hide. Their journey across the mesa was a grueling ordeal. The sun beat down and their thirst, which had been a dull ache, became a sharp, insistent pain. The single canteen was nearly empty. Silas gave the last few mouthfuls to Ellie, ignoring her protests. "You're not used to this," he stated simply, as if that ended the argument. "I am." His body was a testament to his words. He moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his senses tuned to the subtle language of the wilderness. He was a man in his element, even as that element was trying to kill him. Ellie, for her part, was a revelation. She was not a liability. She was a partner. She matched his pace without complaint, her eyes sharp, her movements efficient. She pointed out a barely visible game trail that saved them a mile of hard walking and identified a plant whose roots, when chewed, could provide a small amount of moisture and stave off the worst of their thirst. She was her father's daughter, a child of this land, and its harsh lessons were ingrained in her. They found a brief respite in the shade of a lone, twisted juniper tree, its branches bleached white by the sun. It was there that Silas began to share a piece of himself. He didn't talk about the rangers or the bloody incident that had made him quit. He talked about the land itself. He spoke of the vast rolling plains of Texas, the stark beauty of the Arizona desert, the quiet majesty of the Colorado mountains. He spoke of it as a man speaks of a demanding and unforgiving lover he cannot bring himself to leave. This land, he said, his gaze sweeping across the shimmering horizon, it doesn't care if you live or die. It offers no promises. But it's honest. Its dangers are out in the open. A rattlesnake will warn you before it strikes. A blizzard will show its hand for days. It's not like men. Men will smile at you, shake your hand, and slide a knife in your back. His words were a clear reference to Alistair Finch, but they were also a window into his own soul, into the betrayal that had driven him into this wandering, solitary life. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain began to change. The flat mesa gave way to a jumble of rocky hills and shallow wooded canyons. They had reached the broken country. They were no longer as exposed, but the tracking would be easier here. They moved with even more caution, often walking backwards in dusty patches or sticking to bare rock to leave as little sign as possible. But Silas knew it was only a matter of time. A man like Cain didn't just follow tracks. He followed logic. He would know their general direction, their need for water, their ultimate goal of reaching the high meadows. He wasn't just behind them. He was in their heads. Late in the day, their luck seemed to turn. They stumbled upon a small spring-fed pool of water hidden in a rocky alcove, the water clear and cold. It was a miracle. They drank deeply, refilled the canteen, and splashed the cool water on their faces, the relief so intense it was almost painful. For a moment, they allowed themselves to relax. The water, the shade, the relative safety of the hills, it felt like a sanctuary. But Silas's instincts, honed by years of survival, screamed at him that something was wrong. It was too easy, too perfect. He stood up, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, and slowly scanned the ridges surrounding their little oasis. And then he saw him. High on the ridge to their west, partially concealed by a cluster of pinyon pines, was the silhouette of a man on a horse. He was perfectly still, just watching them. It was Cain. He hadn't been following them. He had been ahead of them. He had read their minds, anticipated their need for water, and had simply ridden to the most logical watering hole on their path and waited. The feeling of being hunted was replaced by the terrifying certainty of being trapped. Silas slowly drew his pistol. There was no point in hiding. Cain had already seen them. Ellie, following his gaze, let out a small, sharp gasp. The hunter hadn't made a move. He was just sitting there, a patient predator who knew his prey was cornered. Silas said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get back in the rocks. Stay down and do not move no matter what happens." "Understand?" She nodded, her face pale, and scrambled back into the deepest part of the alcove. Silas stepped out into the open, positioning himself so that his back was to a solid wall of rock. He was a clear target, but he would not be flanked. He raised his Colt, the long barrel looking like a natural extension of his arm. The distance was extreme for a pistol, but it was a declaration. He would not run. For a long moment, the two men were frozen in a silent standoff, separated by 200 yards of sun-drenched rock and scrub. Then Cain slowly raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a signal. And from the ridge to the east, another rider appeared, and another to the north. They were surrounded. Cain hadn't just been waiting for them. He had been positioning his men, laying a perfect, inescapable trap. The posse had been guided by a master. A voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the rocky basin echoed down to them. It wasn't Cain's. It was the wheezing, triumphant voice of Sheriff Brody. "It's over, Cain. We got you boxed in. Send out the girl and we might just let you live." Silas knew it was a lie. Finch wanted no witnesses. But the situation had just become impossibly dire. It wasn't a one-on-one confrontation with a tracker. It was him, a girl, and a single pistol against at least 4 riflemen who held the high ground. The clear, cold water of the spring suddenly felt like a bait in a deadly trap that had just snapped shut around them. The word surrender wasn't in Silas Cain's vocabulary. He stood his ground in the center of the rocky basin, a solitary, defiant figure against the unblinking eyes of the riflemen on the ridges. He knew that any attempt at negotiation was futile. Brody's offer was a lie designed to get them to expose themselves. The moment they stepped out, they'd be cut down. His mind, cool and clear, even in the face of impossible odds, was not on surrender, but on survival. He needed to shatter their confidence, to turn their perfect trap into a chaotic mess. "Stay put, Ellie," he said, his voice low, but carrying to her hiding place. "This is going to get loud." He fired first. Not at any of the riflemen who were still just silhouettes against the sky, but at a large, precariously balanced boulder on the slope just below Sheriff Brody. The heavy slug from his peacemaker struck the rock with the force of a hammer blow. It wasn't enough to dislodge it, but it sent a shower of granite chips flying and produced a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the basin like a cannon shot. The unexpected aggression, the sheer audacity of a man who was hopelessly outgunned firing the first shot, had its intended effect. It startled them. One of the riflemen fired back in a knee-jerk reaction, his shot going wide, ricocheting off the rocks high above Silas's head with a high-pitched scream. The perfect disciplined trap was beginning to fray at the edges. Silas used that single chaotic moment to move diving behind a thick outcropping of rock as another bullet chewed up the dirt where he had been standing. He was pinned down, but he was no longer a static target. The basin erupted into a full-blown firefight. Bullets whined and ricocheted through the small canyon, chipping away at the rocks, sending dust and stone fragments flying. Silas was frugal with his shots, making each one count. He didn't fire to kill, he fired to suppress. A quick shot toward a puff of smoke from a rifle, another toward a glimpse of movement. He was forcing them to keep their heads down, preventing them from taking careful aim. He was a hornet in a bottle, and the posse was growing frustrated, their initial confidence eroding into angry, undisciplined shooting. From her hiding place, Ellie watched in terror and awe. She felt a familiar, suffocating helplessness creeping back in the same feeling she'd had on the gallows. But then she saw Silas, one man holding off a small army fighting for her, and something inside her shifted. The fire she had shown on the platform rekindled. She would not be a spectator in her own fate. She began to scan her surroundings, not for a place to hide, but for a way to fight. Her eyes fell upon the spring. The water bubbled up from the ground and flowed in a small, weak trickle down a narrow channel in the rock. But above the spring, the ground was soft and dark with moisture. The entire slope was saturated. And above that, the hillside was a steep, unstable mess of loose dirt and rocks, held in place by a fragile network of roots and scrub. An idea born of desperation and a farmer's understanding of the land took root in her mind. While the posse's attention was entirely focused on Silas, Ellie began to crawl. She moved away from the firefight, staying low, using the rocks as cover. She made her way to the narrow channel of water flowing from the spring. Using her bare hands and a flat piece of rock as a makeshift shovel, she began to build a small crude dam. She packed it with mud and stones, blocking the trickle of water, forcing it to back up and spread out further, saturating the already unstable ground at the base of the slope below Kane's position. It was slow, agonizing work. Her fingernails broke and her hands were raw, but she worked with a feverish intensity. Silas, meanwhile, was in a precarious situation. He was down to his last few bullets, and the posse, realizing he wasn't an infinite source of ammunition, was growing bolder. Brody was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a flanking maneuver. They were going to try to rush him from two sides. He knew he could take one or two of them with him, but he wouldn't survive the assault. He was preparing to make his final stand. It was then that he heard Ellie's voice, a sharp, clear shout from across the basin. Silas, the ground. He risked a quick glance in her direction. He saw what she had done, the dark, spreading patch of mud at the base of the hill. He understood her plan instantly. It was a desperate, brilliant gambit. He turned his attention to the slope below Kane. He had been saving his last 3 bullets. He used them now. He didn't aim at Kane himself, but at the base of the now super-saturated slope. The bullets fired in quick succession acted like triggers. They tore into the soft, muddy earth, breaking the fragile cohesion that held the hillside together. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a low groaning sound, the earth began to move. It started as a small slump, then gathered momentum. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood landslide. It was a mudslide, a thick, heavy slurry of dirt, rock, and water that began to flow down the hill. It wasn't fast enough to bury Kane, but it was treacherous and unpredictable. The ground beneath the tracker's horse gave way. The animal whinnied in terror, its legs sinking into the mud, fighting for footing. Kane, a master horseman, was forced to dismount, jumping clear as his horse struggled in the mire. He was now on foot. His position compromised, his attention completely diverted. The mudslide had also created the perfect cover. It was a moving curtain of earth and debris between Silas and the rest of the posse. Brody and his men, stunned by the unexpected turn of events, ceased firing, their view of the basin obscured. Now Ellie Run Silas roared. He broke from his cover and scrambled toward her, his empty pistol now just a useless weight in his hand. He grabbed her arm, and together they plunged into the thickest part of the woods at the back of the alcove, the same woods that led east toward the high meadows. They were running not in a panicked retreat, but in a tactical withdrawal made possible by the quick thinking of a farmer's daughter. They could hear the shouts of fury and confusion behind them as Brody's men realized what had happened. They had escaped the trap, but they were far from safe. They were now deeper in the wilderness with no horse, no food, and an empty gun. And they had just made a very personal, very deadly enemy out of the man called Cain, who they had left standing humiliated and furious in a river of mud. The hunt was about to get personal. The adrenaline that had fueled their escape from the basin began to ebb, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. They ran until their lungs burned, and their legs felt like lead, plunging deeper into the dense, tangled forest that cloaked the eastern hills. The sounds of the posse faded behind them, but the silence that replaced it was not comforting. It was the silence of a wilderness that was now their prison as much as it was their sanctuary. They had no supplies, no horse, and an empty pistol. They were alive, but their situation was more desperate than ever. They finally collapsed at the base of a towering ponderosa pine, their breathing coming in ragged gasps. For a long while, neither of them spoke the shared reality of their predicament, too heavy for words. It was Ellie who finally broke the silence, her voice a hoarse whisper. "We can't stop. They'll be on our trail as soon as they get their horses out of that mud." Silas nodded, though every muscle in his body screamed in protest. He knew she was right. Cain was not a man to be trifled with. The humiliation of the mudslide would have transformed his professional pursuit into a personal vendetta. He would hunt them with a renewed, vicious intensity. Silas pushed himself to his feet and offered a hand to Ellie. His respect for her had grown tenfold. She wasn't just resilient. She was a fighter, a thinker. She had saved them back there. "You have any more farmer's tricks up your sleeve?" he asked, a hint of a wry smile touching his lips for the first time. She managed a weak smile in return. "My father taught me how to read the land," she said. He always said, "The land provides if you know where to look. We need to find water first. Then we worry about food." She took the lead, her eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the slope of the land. She was looking for the subtle signs that Silas, for all his frontier experience, might have missed. She pointed to a line of cottonwood trees in a shallow valley below them. "Trees like that don't grow without water near the surface," she explained. They made their way down, and sure enough, they found a small, sluggish creek, the water murky but life-sustaining. They drank their fill and refilled the canteen, the simple act of quenching their thirst, a small but significant victory. Their next objective was the line shack, where they hoped to find Caleb. According to Ellie, it was another 5 miles to the northeast, through some of the roughest country in the territory. A 5-mile hike for a man in good condition was a few hours' walk. For them in their exhausted and weakened state, it would be an all-day ordeal, and that was time they didn't have. As they rested by the creek, Silas took stock of their assets. They had one knife, one empty Colt, and the clothes on their backs. And they had each other. He took the empty pistol from his holster. It was useless as a firearm, but it was still a solid piece of steel. He began to work his hands sure and practiced. He used a sharp rock to pry the lead slugs from the last few cartridges he had left. He then used the back of his knife to carefully tap out the black powder from each casing onto a dry leaf. He was left with a small but precious pile of gunpowder. "What are you doing?" Ellie asked, watching him with curiosity. "Fighting back," he said grimly. He found a piece of dry, punky wood, and using the lens from Finch's gold pocket watch, which he'd retrieved from the gallows, he focused the afternoon sun into a single, intense point. It took several long, patient minutes, but finally a thin curl of smoke rose from the wood. He gently blew it into a flame and used it to light a small, well-concealed fire. While the fire was taking hold, he fashioned a crude but effective bow from a strong, supple branch of juniper and used his own bootlaces to string it. He carved arrows from straight shoots of willow fire, hardening the tips. It was a primitive weapon, but it was better than nothing. They spent the night huddled by the fire, taking turns sleeping and keeping watch. The sounds of the forest, which would normally be a comfort to Silas, now seemed filled with menace. Every snap of a twig, every hoot of an owl sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. In the depths of the night during her watch, Ellie finally asked the question that had been hanging between them. "You said you were tired of watching," she said, her voice soft in the darkness. "What did you mean? What did you watch?" Silas was silent for a long time, the firelight casting dancing shadows on his grim face. He had never told anyone the full story. But looking at this girl who had faced death with such courage and was now fighting so hard for her family and her home, he felt that she, of all people, deserved the truth. He told her about his time as a ranger, about the rising tide of corruption where powerful men like Finch were buying up lawmen and judges. He told her about the homesteader's wife, a woman named Maria, and how he and his men had been ordered to stand by while a land baron's vigilantes accused her of rustling and hanged her all so he could seize her water rights. "I followed my captain's orders," Silas said, his voice thick with a self-loathing that time had not diminished. He said it was a local matter. "I stood there with a badge on my chest and a gun on my hip, and I watched them murder an innocent woman. I turned in my badge the next day. I've been running from her ghost ever since. When I saw you on that platform, I saw her. I couldn't just watch again." His confession hung in the air, a raw and painful offering. Ellie didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. She simply reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture of understanding and shared purpose that meant more than any words could have. They were two broken people, haunted by the same injustice, brought together by fate in a fight against the same kind of darkness. The next morning, as they were preparing to leave, they heard it, the baying of a hound. It was distant, but unmistakable. Kane had brought a dog. The game had changed again. Their scent was now a liability. They couldn't just rely on hiding their tracks. They had to break their trail completely. The creek, Silas said, his eyes gleaming with a desperate idea. He looked at Ellie. "How far does it run?" "All the way to the falls at Eagle's Pass," she replied. "About 2 miles from here." "Then that's where we go," he said. They plunged into the cold water of the creek, the icy shock taking their breath away. They began to make their way downstream, sometimes wading, sometimes swimming the current, helping them along. It was a grueling, miserable journey. The water washed away their scent, but it also sapped their strength and their body heat. They had to pray it would be enough to throw the dog off their trail, to buy them the precious time they needed to get to the line shack and find Caleb, their last best hope in a world that had suddenly become very small and very, very dangerous. The journey down the creek was a frozen, agonizing hell. The water, born from mountain snowmelt, was relentlessly cold, leaching the warmth from their bodies, turning their limbs numb and their movements clumsy. They clung to the banks, using overhanging branches to pull themselves along their clothes, and boots transformed into heavy, waterlogged weights. The constant threat of the pursuing hound was a spur driving them onward even as their bodies screamed for them to stop, to crawl onto the bank and succumb to the shivering exhaustion. But they knew that to stop was to die. After what felt like an eternity, they heard the sound they had been praying for, the low-growing roar of a waterfall. They had reached Eagle's Pass. They half climbed, half crawled out of the creek just above the falls, collapsing onto a sun-warmed slab of granite, their bodies shaking uncontrollably from the cold. They stripped off their wet outer layers and laid them on the rocks to dry, huddling together for warmth. The shared body heat a small but vital comfort against the chill that had settled deep in their bones. From their perch above the falls, they had a clear view of the creek they had just traveled. They waited, their eyes scanning the far bank, their hearts pounding. Minutes stretched into an hour, and then they saw them. Kane appeared first, moving with his signature patient gait, followed by the hound, a lean, ugly-looking beast with a keen nose. The dog excitedly tracked their scent to the water's edge, ran up and down the bank in confusion, and then let out a frustrated series of howls. Kane stood for a long moment, staring at the flowing water, his face a mask of cold fury. He knew what they had done. He had been outsmarted again. After a brief, angry exchange with Sheriff Brody, who arrived moments later, the posse split up, moving off in different directions to search the banks downstream. The creek had bought them time. "We need to get to that shack," Silas said, his teeth chattering slightly. now. Before they circled back, they dressed in their damp clothes and began the final leg of their journey. The land here was higher, the air thinner, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was beautiful country, a stark contrast to the ugliness of the men who were hunting them through it. As they crested a final wooded ridge, Ellie let out a small, sharp cry and pointed. There, nestled in a secluded meadow, surrounded by a grove of golden-leafed aspens, was the line shack. It was small and rough-hewn, but a thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke was curling from its stone chimney. Someone was there. They approached with caution, Silas taking the lead, his new bow held at the ready. He circled the cabin, his senses on high alert, while Ellie waited in the trees. The shack was quiet, too quiet. He moved to the single grimy window and peered inside. What he saw made his blood run cold. A young boy who could only be Caleb was tied to a chair in the center of the small room. He was gagged, his eyes wide with terror. And standing over him, calmly sharpening a long, wicked-looking knife, was not Kane or Brody, but one of Finch's other men, a hulking, bearded brute Ellie had pointed out during the chase from town. They hadn't beaten the posse to the shack. They had walked right into the heart of the trap. Finch had anticipated this move as well. He knew the boy would hide here, and he had sent a man to wait. Silas backed away from the window, his mind a whirlwind. A direct assault was suicide. The man inside had a rifle leaning against the wall, and he had a hostage. Silas crept back to Ellie and told her what he had seen. The color drained from her face, but her eyes hardened with a cold, desperate resolve. "We have to get him out," she whispered, her voice fierce. I know Silas set his mind racing, trying to formulate a plan from the impossible ingredients he'd been given. But we have one advantage. He doesn't know we're here. He thinks he's the trapper. But right now, he's the one in the trap. He began to outline a desperate, two-pronged plan. The shack had only one door and one window. The man inside would be watching the door. The window was their only way in. "He's big," Silas said, "but he's overconfident. I'm going to create a diversion at the front. I need you to be ready to go through that window the second he's distracted." "What kind of diversion?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The loud kind," Silas replied. He began to gather dry tinder and pine cones, stuffing them into the spare shirt he had taken from his saddlebags. He then found a long, sturdy pole. He worked quickly, his hands a blur of motion, his face set in a grim mask of concentration. He was no longer just a wanderer. He was a ranger again, planning a raid, the old deadly instincts taking over completely. He gave Ellie his knife. "When you go in, don't hesitate. Cut Caleb free and get him out the back. There's a small game trail behind the shack. Follow it down to the stream. Don't wait for me. Just run." "Understand," she nodded, her eyes locked on his, a silent promise passing between them. He took his position near the front of the cabin, hidden behind a large tree. He took a deep breath, the fate of all three of them resting on the next few minutes. He gave Ellie a final sharp nod. It was time. He lit the bundle of cloth on the end of his pole. It caught fire with a whoosh, burning hot and fast. He then stepped out from behind the tree, and with a guttural war cry that was more animal than human, he charged the cabin. He didn't run for the door. He ran for the roof. He used the corner of the cabin to get a foothold, and scrambled onto the low-sloping roof, the makeshift torch held high. The man inside, hearing the scream, rushed to the window, his rifle in his hand. He saw the fire and the wild-looking man on his roof, and was for a crucial second completely baffled. That was the moment Silas had been waiting for. He jammed the burning torch into the dry thatch of the roof near the chimney. The dry material caught fire instantly, smoke and flames beginning to billow. The man inside cursed his attention now completely on the fire above his head. He had to get out, and he had to put out the fire. And that was the second of distraction Ellie needed. As the man turned from the window toward the door, she smashed the grimy pane of glass with a rock, unlocked the latch, and scrambled inside. She was a whirlwind of motion. She ran to her brother, slashing at his bonds with the knife. The big man heard the glass break and spun around his face a mask of disbelief and rage. He saw Ellie, saw the freed boy, and he raised his rifle, but he never got the chance to fire. Silas, having accomplished his mission, dropped from the roof, landing at a crouch right in front of the only door. The man was trapped inside a burning cabin with a furious ex-ranger blocking his only escape. The hunter had become the prey. The simple line shack had just become a death trap, and the final brutal confrontation for Caleb's life was about to take place amidst the smoke and flames. The interior of the line shack was a chaotic scene of smoke, fear, and desperation. The fire on the roof was spreading rapidly, filling the small space with a thick, acrid haze that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. The hulking brute from town, whose name was Larson, was trapped between two threats: the fire eating its way through the ceiling above him, and the grim, determined silhouette of Silas Kane blocking the doorway. His brief moment of victorious complacency had evaporated, replaced by the cornered animal fury of a man who suddenly found himself on the losing end of a fight. He leveled his rifle at Silas, but the doorway was a terrible shooting position. Silas was a dark shape against the bright afternoon light, making him a difficult target, while Larson was illuminated by the flickering firelight inside. "Get out of the way, old man," Larson roared, his voice a mixture of anger and panic. Silas didn't move. He stood his ground, his makeshift bow held loosely in his hand. He wasn't just blocking the exit. He was a psychological barrier, a calm, immovable object in the face of Larson's frantic rage. Inside, Ellie had managed to cut through the last of the ropes binding her brother. "Caleb, go!" Through the window she yelled, pushing the terrified but resilient boy toward the opening she had made. Caleb, though shaky, obeyed instantly, scrambling through the broken window and out into the fresh air. Ellie turned to follow, but Larson was too fast. He lunged not at Silas, but at her, grabbing a fistful of her hair and yanking her back. He pressed the cold muzzle of his rifle against her temple. "One more step, Kane, and she dies." Larson screamed, using Ellie as a human shield. He began to back toward the door, dragging her with him. "I'm walking out of here. You're going to let me go, or I swear I'll splatter her brains all over this cabin." Silas's face was unreadable, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. His plan had worked, but it had also gone horribly wrong. Caleb was free, but Ellie was now in more danger than ever. He couldn't risk a shot with his bow. The chance of hitting Ellie was too high. He had to think, had to find another way. The fire was growing hotter, sparks and burning embers now falling from the ceiling. The roof wouldn't hold for much longer. "Let her go, Larson," Silas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You walk out of here with her, and you won't make it 100 yards. Kane and the sheriff are out there. You think they'll risk hitting her to get to me number? They'll wait, and then they'll hunt you down. You're a loose end. Finch will want you silenced as much as he wants us silenced." It was the same argument he had used on Thorne, a gamble that a hired thug's self-preservation would outweigh his loyalty. But Larson was not a thinker like Kane. He was a brute, operating on instinct and fear. "Shut up," he bellowed, his grip on Ellie tightening. He was at the doorway now, the heat of the fire at his back, the impassive form of Silas in front of him. From outside, Caleb watched in horror. He saw his sister, his hero, held hostage, about to be dragged into the wilderness by a monster. The fear that had paralyzed him for 2 days was suddenly burned away by a surge of pure protective rage. He looked around wildly, his eyes landing on a stack of firewood near the side of the cabin. He grabbed the heaviest log he could lift, a solid piece of oak. He was just a boy, but he was a boy who would not let his sister be taken. Just as Larson was about to step through the doorway, using Ellie as his shield, Caleb acted. He ran from the side of the cabin, and with a scream of pure fury, swung the heavy log with all his might, aiming not at Larson, but at the man's knees. The blow connected with a sickening crunch. Larson howled in agony, his leg buckling beneath him. His hold on Ellie faltered for a single crucial second. That was the only opening Silas needed. He didn't fire an arrow. He lunged forward, using the bow itself as a weapon, slamming the hard juniper wood into Larson's rifle, knocking it aside. The gun discharged the bullet, tearing harmlessly into the dirt floor. Silas followed through, driving his shoulder into the big man's chest, sending him stumbling back into the burning cabin. Ellie scrambled free, crawling through the doorway to safety. Larson, his legs shattered, tried to raise himself from the floor, his face a mask of pain and hatred. But the fire, which had been his enemy, was now his prison. A heavy burning beam from the ceiling crashed down, blocking his path, showering him with sparks. He was trapped. Silas stood in the doorway, watching for a moment, the heat of the inferno washing over him. There was no victory in his eyes, only a grim, weary sadness. He turned away from the cabin, from the screams that were quickly being consumed by the roar of the flames, and went to Ellie and Caleb. He knelt before the boy who was shaking the heavy log, dropped at his feet. "You were brave, son," Silas said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved your sister's life." Ellie threw her arms around her brother, holding him tight, the two of them a small, fierce island of family in a world that had tried to tear them apart. When the embrace finally broke, Ellie looked at Silas, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. But their ordeal was far from over. The fire, now consuming the entire shack, was sending a massive column of black smoke into the sky, a signal more potent than any campfire. Kane, Brody, and the rest of the posse would see it for miles. They would be here soon. They had saved Caleb, but in doing so, they had given away their position to the entire hunting party. "We need to go," Silas said, his voice urgent. He looked at Caleb. "Your father," he began gently, "he hid something that can save all of this. He told your sister it was in the heart of the family. Do you know what he meant?" Caleb, his face streaked with soot and tears, looked from the burning remains of the shack to his sister's hopeful, pleading eyes. He nodded slowly. "I think so," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's not a place. It's a thing." He looked toward the west, back in the direction of their ravaged farm. "It's in my mother's hope chest, the one he built for her before I was born. It's the only thing he saved from the fire when the old barn burned down. He always said it held everything that mattered." The riddle was solved. The heart of the family wasn't a location. It was an object, a repository of memory and love. And the true deed, the key to their salvation, was hidden inside it. But the hope chest was back at the Monroe farm, a place that was undoubtedly being watched, a place they would have to infiltrate. And now, thanks to the pillar of smoke marking their location, they had the entire posse bearing down on them, their escape routes cut off. They had found the answer, but they were about to be caught in a closing ring of fire and guns. The plume of smoke from the burning line shack was a death warrant hanging in the sky. It was a beacon that would draw every one of Finch's men to their location, like moths to a flame. They had no time to mourn, no time to rest. They had to move. The revelation about the hope chest had given them a desperate goal, but the logistics of reaching it seemed impossible. The Monroe farm was miles away, back toward Providence, back toward the heart of the danger. "We can't go back there," Ellie said, the reality of their situation crashing down on her. "Finch will have men watching the farm. It's the one place they'll expect us to go." "Which is exactly why we have to." Silas countered his mind already, formulating a plan from the ashes of their last one. "But we won't go in the way they expect." He looked at Caleb. "Son, is there another way onto your land? A back way, a path that no one else would know?" Caleb, still shaken, but his mind clear, nodded. "There's the old wash," he said. "The one behind the south pasture. It's all overgrown. Most people think it's impassable. But Dad and I used to take it to go fishing. It comes out right behind the spring house, less than 50 yards from the main house. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. Their immediate problem, however, was the posse. They could hear the distant sounds of men shouting, of horses crashing through the underbrush. They were closing in, fanning out to encircle the burning cabin. Silas led Ellie and Caleb away from the clearing, moving deeper into the woods, using the thick vegetation for cover. He found a deep, narrow ravine, almost a crack in the earth, concealed by a thicket of wild currants. "In here," he commanded. "Stay low and stay silent. They'll sweep the area. With luck, they'll think we ran as soon as the fire started and are long gone." The three of them huddled in the ravine, a space so cramped their shoulders touched. They could hear the posse getting closer, the crunch of boots on dry leaves, the jingle of harnesses. At one point, Sheriff Brody and another man passed so close to their hiding spot that they could hear their gruff voices clearly. "They're gone," Brody grumbled, "probably halfway to the next territory by now. The fire gave them all the cover they needed." They heard Kane's voice, colder and more measured, disagreeing. "They're on foot. They wouldn't have gotten far. They're hiding. We'll find them. The search continued for what felt like an eternity. Finally, as dusk began to fall, the sounds of the posse receded. They had given up the immediate search, likely to regroup and plan a more systematic hunt for the morning. When the woods were finally silent and draped in the deep shadows of twilight, Silas deemed it safe to move. Their journey back to the farm was a harrowing nocturnal trek. They moved like ghosts through the darkness, Silas taking the lead, his senses on high alert, with Ellie and Caleb following in his footsteps. They bypassed trails and roads, sticking to the roughest, most difficult terrain to minimize their tracks. They finally reached the edge of the Monroe property just before dawn, hiding in a rocky outcropping that overlooked their land. The sight was a heart-wrenching one for Ellie and Caleb. Their small, tidy farm had been transformed. The main house was still standing, but it looked bruised and violated. The windows were shattered. The front door hung from a single hinge, and the contents of the house had been tossed out into the yard, a sad, broken jumble of a life's possessions. And just as Ellie had predicted, the farm was being watched. Two of Finch's men were camped near the main road, a small campfire burning, their rifles leaning against a log. The hope chest, Ellie whispered, her voice tight with emotion. It was in my parents' bedroom at the foot of their bed. They threw everything out. They scanned the yard. And then Caleb pointed. There, he said. There, lying on its side near a trampled rosebush, was a beautifully carved wooden chest, its lid broken, its contents spilled onto the dirt. It was the heart of their family, desecrated and discarded. And inside it, if Caleb was right, was the one document that could avenge their father and save their home. The plan had to be perfect. They couldn't risk a direct confrontation with the two guards. They had to get to the chest, find the deed, and disappear without the guards ever knowing they were there. Once again, Silas's mind turned to diversion, but this time he had an advantage. He had two partners who knew this land better than anyone. Caleb, Silas said, turning to the boy. You know the livestock, the old bull in the south pasture. What's his temperament? A small, mischievous smile touched Caleb's lips for the first time. Old Moses, he said. He's meaner than a cornered badger. Hates everyone, 'cept Dad. Perfect, Silas said. The new plan was simple, yet elegant in its audacity. Caleb would sneak down to the south pasture. He would open the gate and provoke old Moses, driving the enraged bull up toward the main road and the guards' camp. The ensuing chaos of dealing with a rampaging one-ton bull would be more than enough distraction. While the guards were occupied, Silas and Ellie would slip into the farmyard, retrieve the deed from the chest, and meet Caleb at the wash behind the spring house. Under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom, the plan was set in motion. Caleb, moving with a stealth that would have made an Apache proud, disappeared into the shadows toward the pasture. Silas and Ellie crept down to the edge of the farmyard, hiding behind a stone wall, their eyes fixed on the guards' campfire. They waited. The first sign that the plan was working was a low, rumbling bellow that seemed to shake the very ground. It was followed by a crash of splintering wood as the pasture gate gave way. The two guards jumped to their feet, grabbing their rifles, their faces alarmed. A moment later, a massive, dark shape came charging out of the gloom, its head low, its horns gleaming. It was old Moses, and he was a force of nature. The guards shouted in panic, one of them firing a wild shot that only seemed to enrage the bull further. They scattered, one man scrambling up a tree, the other making a desperate run for the flimsy safety of the farmhouse porch. The bull in its fury began to systematically destroy their camp, goring their bedrolls and trampling their supplies. Go, Silas hissed. He and Ellie broke from cover, sprinting across the 50 yards of open ground to the broken hope chest. They fell to their knees, their hands frantically sifting through the scattered contents, old letters, a wedding dress, a child's worn teddy bear. It was a violation, a desecration of a family's most precious memories. It's not here, Ellie said, her voice rising in panic as she reached the bottom of the chest. There was no oilcloth packet, no official-looking document, just the cedar-scented wood of the chest itself. Silas ran his hands along the inside of the chest, his fingers searching for any irregularity. And then he felt it, a slight unevenness in the bottom panel. He took his knife and pried at the edge. A section of the bottom, a false bottom, popped loose. And there, lying in the secret compartment, was a slim portfolio wrapped in oilcloth. They had it. A triumphant, relieved laugh escaped Ellie's lips. But their victory was cut short by a shout from the farmhouse porch. The guard, having reached a position of relative safety, had seen them. He raised his rifle, taking careful aim. There was no cover, nowhere to run. They were caught exposed in the center of the yard, the proof of Finch's crimes in their hands, but with no way to escape the bullet that was about to end their fight for justice once and for all. The rifle cracked the sound sharp and final in the gray light of dawn. But it wasn't Ellie or Silas who fell. It was the guard on the porch. He collapsed like a puppet, with its strings cut, a look of utter surprise on his face, a dark stain spreading across his chest. For a moment, Silas was stunned, believing a miracle had occurred. Then he saw the source of the shot. Standing at the edge of the woods, a smoking rifle in his hands, was the tracker, Kane. Before Silas could even process this impossible turn of events, Kane shifted his aim and fired again. The second guard, who was just beginning to climb down from the tree, yelped and dropped to the ground, clutching a wounded leg. Kane had not saved them by accident. He had systematically and efficiently taken out both of Finch's men. Silas instinctively pushed Ellie behind him, raising his hands slowly, the portfolio clutched in his fist. Kane walked calmly across the yard, his rifle held at a casual, non-threatening angle. Old Moses the bull his rage spent, and his immediate adversaries neutralized, snorted, and trotted back toward the pasture. Caleb emerged from the shadows, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "What is this?" Silas demanded, as Kane stopped a few feet away. "A change in management," Kane said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He wasn't looking at Silas, but at the portfolio. Finch made a mistake. He never should have brought in outsiders. After you escaped the fire, he got spooked. Sent a wire to the senator he's in bed with. The senator sent his own man down on the midnight train. A fixer. I heard them talking. The plan was to kill everyone. You, the girl, the boy, and then me and Brody. The local loose ends. Finch was going to sell us all out to save his own skin. The pieces clicked into place. Kane was a survivor. His loyalty was only to himself, and he knew that as long as Finch and the senator were in power, he was a dead man. His only path to survival was to burn the whole rotten structure to the ground. The true deed was his leverage, and Silas and Ellie were his unwitting instruments. "I don't have a quarrel with you, Kane," Kane continued, "or the girl. You're fighters. I respect that. My quarrel is with men who pay you to do their dirty work and then stab you in the back. I'm proposing a new deal. You and I are going to take that deed to the territorial marshal. We are going to tell him everything. I'll testify against Finch and the senator in exchange for full immunity. You get your justice. I get to live. Everybody wins." He paused, a grim smile touching his lips. Except for Finch. It was a deal with the devil, but it was the only deal they had. Silas looked at Ellie, who nodded her consent. They were out of options, and Kane, their relentless pursuer, had just become their most powerful and dangerous ally. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind. Guided by Kane, they bypassed Providence, entirely riding hard for the territorial capital. The journey was a tense, silent affair, an alliance born of pure necessity. They arrived at the marshal's office, three grimy, exhausted figures who had ridden straight out of a war zone. The marshal, a grizzled veteran of the frontier, listened to their story with a stony face, his skepticism evident. But then Silas laid the portfolio on his desk. He unwrapped the oilcloth to reveal the perfectly preserved original deed, its seal intact, its language clear and undeniable. He then showed him the meticulously copied survey maps Ellie's father had made. It was the truth written in ink and paper, undeniable and damning. Kane then delivered the final blow, providing a detailed first-hand account of Finch's conspiracy, naming names, dates, and locations, including the name of the senator. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. The territorial marshal, a man who believed in the law above all else, acted swiftly. A detachment of federal marshals was dispatched to Providence. Alistair Finch was arrested in his office, his face a mask of disbelief, as the empire he had built on lies crumbled around him. He tried to blame everything on Kane and the senator, but the deed was irrefutable. His reign was over. In the end, justice, true justice, rolled through the valley. The fraudulent land claims were nullified. The homesteaders, with the Monroe Deed as their legal precedent, had their farms and their water rights restored. The town of Providence, freed from the grip of fear, held a new election and chose John Monroe's old friend, a fellow farmer, as their new sheriff. Silas, Ellie, and Caleb returned to their farm not as fugitives but as heroes. With the help of their grateful neighbors, they rebuilt their home, raised a new barn, and began the slow healing process of putting their lives back together. The reward money offered by the marshal's office was enough to ensure they would never have to worry about droughts or bad harvests again. One cool evening, months later, Silas stood on the porch of the newly rebuilt Monroe farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the sky. Ellie came and stood beside him, her hand finding his. The silence between them was no longer filled with tension or unspoken questions. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet. "You know," she said softly, "that first day on the gallows, I thought I was looking at just another drifter, another man who would just watch and ride on by." "I was Silas," said his voice rough, with an emotion he rarely showed. "That man died in this valley. I think he was happy to go. He had ridden into Providence looking for a place to forget his past, a place to bury his ghosts. Instead, he had found a reason to stop running. He had found a cause worth fighting for, a family worth protecting, and in the clear, defiant blue eyes of a farmer's daughter, he had finally found a home. He hadn't just saved her from the gallows. They had, in the end, saved each other. And in the quiet heart of the Wild West, they began to build a new story, not of survival, but of life.